Welcome to 10th or Tuesday. This is episode number 36. My name is Michael Boldin. I'm joined by
Michael Maharrey.
So, Mike, today is day 502, 502nd day that the GOP has failed to get rid of Obamacare, plus gun control, Common Core, mass surveillance, bunch of stuff.
Hadn't gotten rid of much of anything, to be honest.
Including the increasing debt and the massive budgets, $1 trillion. It's insane. And you've done some recent reporting for a number of other websites. You've got a really good article over at Mises.org talking about how we've noticed for a number of years that we've been doing this, and a lot of people followed our work on privacy and surveillance because of our work to turn off resources to the NSA data center in Bluffdale, Utah. But that really, if you're talking about privacy and our work on this, that really is only a small piece of the puzzle. For example, the federal government has been funding or handing out all kinds of surveillance gear to local law enforcement, like automated license plate readers, stingray devices that basically spoof cell phone towers. And this article that you had over at the Mises Institute is talking about something that I thought was pretty new but unsurprising, is that the feds are building they're funding, and local law enforcement or local agencies are building a giant new surveillance network on the transportation system. Mike, can you give us a little overview of what's going on?
Yeah, this was a really interesting article because it started off as just a blog post about a bunch of cameras that are being installed along a transit line in the city of Richmond, Virginia. So the federal government helped fund this. They call it Pulse. So it's a rapid transit line that goes through downtown Richmond. And they're putting up over 100 cameras at maybe 24 stops. So it comes out to about 4 cameras per stop. And it was really interesting because, like I said, it was just kind of going to be a blog post. And I started digging into this. I came to find out that these cameras are actually required as part of the agreement that the city entered into when it got funding for this transit line. So in other words, the city got money from the federal government to build this rapid transit system. As part of the agreement, they had to install these camera systems. And as it turns out, this is actually part of a larger surveillance network being built by the Department of Homeland Security, the TSA, and the idea is to create these surveillance networks all over the country using highways, bus lines, transit lines to install these cameras that obviously they see far beyond the transit lines. So it's really, really creepy. And it is, like I said, it is required by the funding agreement. And as it turns out, as I really started digging into this, this is a coalition of local governments, state governments, these federal agencies. Not only that, there's a private nonprofit transportation organization that's actually running a surveillance system. They actually compile all of this data from all over the country. They issue a daily report. They chronicle all of this data and then feed it back to transportation or to police departments across the country. This system is structurally run by a private company that, unsurprisingly, is owned by a bunch of former defense contractors. So you've got this public, private, government, local, state, all of these entities working together to basically spy on you everywhere you go. And it's creepy as hell. I really encourage people to check out that Mises article because I get into depth. I show each of these layers and how they're connected together. And it's really the first time that we've been able to really comprehensively show how the federal government is using state and local agencies and private agencies to build these surveillance systems, to gather data and to dump it in these massive databases.
I think, Mike, this is another huge step towards building basically a nationalized or centralized national police force. It's basically overturning the whole system that we're supposed to have as far as law enforcement. That is, each community has their own law enforcement, their own priorities, and they run into some kind of roadblocks sometime because they're not supposed to be sharing all the same data with everybody. They're not supposed to have all kinds of warrantless information about people's whereabouts, where they're going. If we're kind of looking at the whole network combined, If you're talking about license plate readers, so they know where people go, who they're meeting with based on pictures of their license plates, plus the people who aren't using cars, they're doing public transit, for example. Now they can, I don't know, do they have facial recognition in these things?
They don't
That
yet.
you're aware of, right?
Exactly.
Generally, the way we find out, it's they don't, and then 5 years later, oh, well, they've actually been doing retinal scans on everybody, or
Right.
they've been keeping track of car locations. So this is how we found out about the license plate reader situation, was 8 years after they had started tracking everyone by the location of their vehicle through license plate readers, red light cameras, for example, taking pictures of thousands of cars as they go by every hour or every day, whatever it may be, depending on the city. And then 8 years later, we find out, oh, well, they've been tracking everyone's whereabouts through these cameras. So I am not going to say anything other than it's going to be the same thing done by the TSA and the Department of Homeland Security. We should expect that to be on these public transit systems as they build it up. But this creates a nationalized police force. Law enforcement is supposed to just kind of be, why is someone in the LAPD getting location information about someone on a public bus or a train system or whatever it may be in Richmond, Virginia? Because that's how it works, right? As soon as you transfer the information through information sharing environments or fusion centers, it goes to Washington, D.C., and then it gets spread throughout the entire system. All law enforcement local throughout the country gets this information. So it's creating this nationalized surveillance state that's run by the locals through this wonderful gift of federal funding of expanding transit. They always come up with a way to add stuff onto it.
Yeah, and talking about the facial recognition, Shane Trejo just did an article last week that's on the 10th Amendment Center blog talking about the fact that the Orlando Police Department has entered into an agreement with an Amazon company, feeds all of their cameras into a facial recognition system, and they can actually specify it. It gave this example. If I want to know where the mayor of Orlando is, they can put his face into the system, and Amazon can locate that person using all of the hundreds of cameras, because Orlando's a smart city. It has hundreds of cameras. All of these are going into these central databases. So it's creepy as all get out, and it really does have an impact on your local community. I was having a discussion with David Knight over at Real News on InfoWars about this very thing, and we made the point that this is turning us into a national police organization where the national government, the federal government, is determining what your local police are doing. They're not worrying about solving local crimes. They're worrying about making sure that they're meeting all of the criteria that are imposed on them by the federal government when they accept all of these funds. So it's changing the way policing is done. It's changing the priorities. It's turning your police department into soldiers in the war on drugs and the war on terror, instead of trying to find rapists and burglars and murderers in your own city. So not only is it creepy, not only is it a violation of your privacy, it's also ruining policing and making your community arguably more dangerous.
It's interesting to me. I hear from basically two categories of people when it comes to this surveillance, and you're talking about Amazon here, or Facebook, for example, collecting data. There's one kind of camp that is only concerned about the corporations, because corporations are top of the food chain to them, and they're extremely dangerous, and you don't want them collecting this data because they're going to serve you crazy ads, or they're going to monitor where you are, whatever. Don't trust the corporations. Maybe the corporations have already taken over the world, and these overlords are going to destroy us. And then another camp is basically, business is private. You have a choice to deal with them, whatever it may be. They can do whatever they want. You should opt out if you don't like it. And they're not dangerous. It's government that's dangerous. But unfortunately, many of the largest businesses really only exist because of either government backing, government support, licensing or regulation that keeps out competition. And like you hear, Mark Zuckerberg is basically begging for government regulation of Facebook and the internet. Well, that's going to make it much more difficult to have any competition. So there's may not be a Friendster to Facebook transition, Facebook to whatever's next, if he gets the regulation that he wants. What's most dangerous is these situations. Of course, his government is the one with the guns.
Right.
But Facebook is extremely dangerous, and so is Amazon, and so is Google, so are these other properties, because they are partners with the worst aspects of government. There was a petition. Trevor Tim, who's a Press Freedom Foundation guy, he reports a lot over at The Guardian in the UK. He actually has been following this situation where Google is providing all kinds of AI for drone warfare, and it got out. And there were thousands of employees that signed on saying Google shouldn't be providing support and resources for weapons of war to the U.S. government. They didn't want to do it. They didn't want to be part of a company. Maybe a handful of people resigned. Well, Google said they're not going to renew this contract. But it's going to take that type of pressure to not participate with the businesses that are helping the worst parts of government programs, or all of them, over time. So it is, I think both of those camps are kind of on the wrong side. They're missing part of the puzzle.
Right, I agree.
It's this whole combination that's basically out to destroy your rights.
Absolutely, and it's the you see it vividly in this illustration of these Richmond cameras. You have the local police, the local Richmond government, the state of Virginia is involved, the TSA, the DHS, a nonprofit organization that's supposed to be advocating, international transportation priorities, and then a private corporation that, like I said, is owned by a bunch of former defense people. All of these pieces are working together to create this massive surveillance. And so we need to kind of focus in where we have control. And we do have some control over our local governments. We can prohibit our local governments from having this kind of surveillance equipment without at least notifying the public, having some public debate. And fortunately, we're seeing a big movement of that across the country. So I think that's one of the ways we can fight back against this, is by taking control of our local governments and stopping them from entering into these partnerships to begin with.
Yeah, it's basically, if they're not collecting the database, they're not taking the funding with the strings of you have to spy, then the surveillance doesn't happen.
Right.
They're going to have to find another way, or at least it pushes. I would rather kick the can down the road than have it happen right now. Have the surveillance happening. Like, okay, maybe it won't happen today, and maybe it'll happen later, but if it's not happening now, that's very positive. So you've also did another report on privacy localism, these efforts to protect privacy or not participate in massive surveillance efforts on a local level. There's been a number of communities that have passed local ordinances to take steps against that. For example, Oakland just recently passed one. Tell us about that a little bit, Mike.
Yeah, so this is actually part of a concerted effort by a coalition of organizations. 10th Amendment Center is part of that, the ACLU, the Electronic Frontier Foundation. Did I say that right?
Yeah.
Yeah. A lot of different organizations have come together to push these local ordinances that, in a nutshell, they require a city government to give approval to any agency that is obtaining and using surveillance equipment. That's primarily the police department, although, there are other organizations that will get surveillance equipment. Obviously,
transit agencies for sure. I mean, I take public transit here. I take government transit here in Los Angeles, and there's all kinds of cameras. I'm sure they're feeding that data into something.
Absolutely. So these ordinances at least require government approval, local government approval after a public meeting. It allows the public an avenue to get involved. It allows organizations like there in LA, Stop LA Spying, where they can actually go and protest and bring this thing into the light, because so much of this stuff happens in secret. Nobody knew that the city of Richmond had entered into an agreement to put 100 cameras in their downtown.
Mind you, no one knew that the NSA Bluffdale facility was going to be doing what it is, the largest data storage facility. I think it's being surpassed in San Antonio now, but at the time, the largest NSA data storage facility on Earth. No one knew that was happening until the agreement was signed. And this is really how they're nationalizing. Another way they're nationalizing local police. We don't want a national police force, surveillance, drug warrior. We don't want a national parking enforcement force, none of it. Because you have no place to escape when they do things wrong. You need more when you have one point of failure. people who are in kind of computer networking recognize
Right.
this. It's called a distributed network, not necessarily just decentralized, but distributed. If you have one point of failure, when that one point does something wrong, it's bad for everyone. But if you have multiple points of failure or success, then if one point does something wrong, you can escape to the other area.
Yeah.
So that's the whole idea behind the 10th Amendment, federalism, the founder system. And then we can take this to even more of a local level, like what you're talking about, Mike. And what's happening, though, is the federal government is basically working directly with local law enforcement. And they're either providing directly to law enforcement gear, surveillance equipment, stingrays, ALPRs, drones, whatever, or the funding to purchase them on the open market without any other process. So the local law enforcement is basically acting as a part of the federal government at that point.
Yeah.
So by making it a decision saying that they aren't allowed to use these surveillance tools even if they already have them, without additional approval from the local governing body, it actually interposes the local government in the process. Many of them are going to make a bad choice, based on my opinion, and say, yeah, we love this money. We want the police to be part of the federal government, basically. But at least give some areas a chance.
Exactly. And we're seeing that. And that's the good news. I think there's I wish I could remember the exact number off the top of my head. It's around 20 different municipalities that are considering these types of ordinances right now. They've already passed in a number. California's leading the way. Like you said, Oakland, the city of Davis, the city of Berkeley.
Santa Clara, I think.
Santa Clara County. And then, but not just in California, Nashville, Tennessee. There's a city, Somerville, Massachusetts.
Right.
Seattle, Washington, and then there are a number of cities that are considering this. And I'm working here in Lexington, Kentucky to try to get an ordinance introduced here, which is like pulling teeth because my local government sucks. But, you know, at least I have some inroads. We're making some progress here because we're making a lot of noise, and it makes politicians uncomfortable when the public makes noise. So
I like more and more personally this strategy of basically saying, not even having the state come in, because I don't trust these state governments either. No one should. They're awful. So are the local governments. They're all awful. But if we're talking again about individual liberty, the closer to the individual that the decision is made, the more likely we'll all have a chance of having more individual liberty. I really like the idea of devolving all these decisions more locally, as local as possible. I was recently talking with some activists, people who have been working on Second Amendment preservation ordinances, attempting to create gun rights sanctuary cities or counties. I was talking to one of the lead petitioners up in Oregon. I believe he's in Coos County, Oregon. And they kind of see the same approach. Like, look, hey, you know, even if we only have one community doing the right thing, Coos County, they're lucky enough to have a sheriff who is refusing to enforce some state gun control measures. I was encouraging them to also get them on board. And I'm not sure, maybe they already are, on not enforcing federal gun control as well. Well, when you have one and then the world doesn't come apart, then maybe a second one will do it.
Right.
And I'd take 2 over 0 any day.
Exactly.
I mean, it's unfortunate. I mean, it almost sounds desperate. It's unfortunate. We have to acknowledge that things are so bad that we're celebrating 1 or 2. So that's, I mean, but it is positive. That's how movements get started. Exactly. We have an opportunity to actually...
2 leads to 3, and then 3 leads to
of
4,
course.
and 4 leads to 14. And, you know, we've seen that vividly with the marijuana issue.
Yes, because when Prop 215 passed in 1996, no one thought this was going to stick around. People were getting threatened. In early 97, Janet Reno, they were quoting her in the LA Times, saying they were talking about taking away the licenses of all doctors in California who recommend marijuana to their patients. Well, I just saw an interview on our good friend Robert Scott Bell. He was interviewing a guy, a doctor, this guy named Dr. McHugh, very kind of establishment kind of doctor, who he said 5 years ago, this doctor said, I didn't even know anything about cannabis at all, but in the last 5 years, I've recommended it to 5,000 patients. Says it openly. He doesn't care.
And we've got John Boehner on the board of a marijuana company now, you know, a well-known drug lawyer. And that came from the bottom up. It started because people in California took the initiative and stuck with it and fought through it, now 22 years ago.
It's my belief that people have been taught that liberty is bad, government is good for a couple of generations at least now. And they don't like liberty. They're afraid. Well, maybe they don't like, it's not that they don't like it. They're afraid of it. oh, well, if you let people be free on this, aren't people going to be dying in the streets? We're not going to be able to catch terrorists if we can't spy on everybody. Nothing teaches people that liberty works more than actually having more liberty in practice.
Exactly.
When they see that there aren't people dying in the streets because there's more freedom, then they're less likely to oppose it in their own area or another area. So that's why bringing the decision closer to home gives us a greater chance to see positive things happening. So it's good to see some ordinances to advance privacy or reject the federalization of local police into the national surveillance state on a local level. This is very positive. It gives an opportunity. Well, that also leads to, you're talking about California leading the way. There is a state bill that would basically remove the state from the process as well.
Right.
And basically it would require it to be a local process. Mm-hmm. So the state is out of it. It basically says the federal government and local governments cannot just go a one-way street or a direct with no exit ramps between federal government and local surveillance. It has to be approved by the local governing body. It has to have open meetings. Anybody who's already using these surveillance apparatuses, this equipment, they have to get new approval to continue it. That's SB 1186. It just passed the state Senate in California.
Yeah, absolutely. And, very positive step forward. Bill is getting a lot of opposition, particularly from your law enforcement agencies.
Always.
Here's how the law enforcement agencies work. Last year, there was a similar bill, and the sheriffs were opposing it because they didn't feel like they needed to be included because they're already elected. So they didn't feel like their local government should have any say over them as an elected official. So when they introduced 1186, they took the sheriffs out of it, and the sheriffs still opposed it. So they put the sheriffs back in.
The moving goalpost.
Yes,
that
exactly.
is very interesting. So it's like the bill originally was, it stalled. It was SB 21. It stalled because of this opposition by sheriff's lobby organizations. So State Senator Jerry Hill reintroduced the bill, trying to move it forward, start fresh, and took the sheriffs out. Well, we weren't a big fan of that part of it because if the LAPD or Oakland PD is blocked, but then the county sheriffs are able to just get whatever federal surveillance gear and then participate as federal surveillance agents, then it really kind of counteracts that, and it doesn't really do any good. So if the sheriff's department are still opposing it, even though the bill didn't do what they didn't want it to do, then it says that the sheriffs were really opposing it for another reason. All these law enforcement lobby groups really want all other law enforcement groups to have as much surveillance equipment as possible. Because they end up getting the information shared with them anyways.
Exactly. It's all part of one giant pie. So you don't want less pie if you're going to get more pie by other people having pie.
So SB 1186 moved forward in the California Senate just on the crossover deadline to be able to pass it. It was a close vote, 21-15. That'll go over to the Assembly probably for a vote in August or September. It's year-round here. Out of surveillance for a little bit, we've got some other things to cover. In Alabama, a bill to remove a very massive roadblock to the use of gold and silver as money is now in effect. In the state of Alabama, SB 156.
Yep, takes all the sales and use taxes off of the sale of gold and silver, makes it easier to buy it, cheaper to buy it, and hopefully it will make it more likely for people to start using it because it removes the tax, it removes that barrier, and everybody knows that when you have a tax, it discourages an activity. So you get rid of that tax, it will encourage the activity, and this is like a first step. It's a way to undermine the Federal Reserve's monopoly on money. If people start using gold and silver in transactions instead of Federal Reserve notes, the hope is that if enough people start doing that, the worthless Federal Reserve notes will begin to fade away into oblivion. And at least we can undermine this Federal Reserve monopoly on money. And I talked about this in my podcast this week, which we'll be posting at the 10th Amendment Center blog sometime in the near future. And I talked about just about how important it is, just what the Federal Reserve has done to destroy our money and destroy our monetary system, and why it's absolutely imperative that we address this issue. The Federal Reserve makes the federal government run. The federal government couldn't do all of this unconstitutional stuff if it wasn't able to print money and inflate the dollar and borrow through the Federal Reserve.
Some people have told me like, oh, okay, so you're moving gold and silver taxes, that's, that's great. But a lot of people don't like, they don't like gold and silver. They find it difficult to use. But that's not really the point. The point is to give the people who want to use it the choice to do it. Right now, they have the choice, but you have to add an extra 8 to 10% on the cost of everything.
Right.
Because you're talking about adding a sales tax every time that gold is exchanged for a product. The way the state government was seeing it, it was you had to actually convert it to fiat and then pay a tax on what it would be worth in fiat, and then you can make the exchange. So if I'm trying to, like most people, trying to just scrape by day to day, an extra 10% on the cost of everything is huge. It's unmanageable, impossible. Now, Alabama, they don't have a real great system for, I don't think anybody has developed a system there for the facilitation of merchant transactions in gold and silver. So like you said, this is a first step, getting that roadblock out of the way. Now we have to leave it to the market to see if people are interested in building the services around it. In Utah, someone already built, in essence, a gold bank. It's not part of the Federal Reserve System, but United Precious Metals Association now allows people to set up, they deposit their gold and silver in an account, they get a debit or a credit card with a Visa logo on it, and they can make electronic transactions, and the conversion happens behind the scene electronically, and they can go to any retailer. The retailer doesn't even have to use the sound money, but the person can. And the more that people do this, the more that other people learn about it. And the more that other people learn about it, that's the whole theory, right?
Yeah, exactly. And there's several other companies. There's Gold Money, that's a national company that.
Oh, that's Peter Schiff's company, right?
Yeah. Full disclosure, I do Peter Schiff's Schiff Gold's blog, so shameless plug there. And then we have the state.
Yeah, because we are definitely opposed to the idea of someone working for somebody and then telling people that they have a good product.
Yeah, absolutely. Can't do that.
Sometimes it's interesting to be like, everybody has to include full disclosure, as if, okay, I work for so-and-so and I'm telling you that they're great. Well, you're going to take it with a grain of salt because I get paid by them. I mean, I know a lot of people work for places that they hate, but I don't.
No, I mean, I don't. That would mean I would hate you. That would be rude.
Anyways, so SB 156 just went into effect last week, Friday, right? Yeah, it was the first in Alabama. Right. Very positive step. And we also are kind of tracking, just as an aside here, the establishment of the Texas Gold,
I was getting ready to
Texas
say that.
Bullion Depository. All right, we're thinking the same way. The Bullion Depository should be online this month, right?
Yeah, I'm on their email list, so I'm going to get an email as soon as they're up and running. He said a couple of weeks ago, they said within the next month. So I would say if they're on schedule within the next couple of weeks, we should hear something, and we'll definitely report on that when it gets up and running.
So I know there's a lot of people who watch what we do that are cryptocurrency users. I encourage you to continue doing that, whatever your cryptocurrency. I personally like BCH as a monetary instrument. But basically, if you're using something that's outside of the Federal Reserve System, you're actually helping liberty. Absolutely. Yep. Every time you make a transaction. So whether you want to use cryptocurrency, or if you're a sound money person and you really want to use gold and silver, you create an account at UPMA or at Gold Money or at the Gold Depository, the Bullion Depository in Texas once it opens up, and you can have electronic transactions that the conversion is done just behind the scene. Maybe you got to keep track of how you're spending a little bit better because you want to know your purchasing power. But this is very helpful. The more that this is part of the system, the more currency competition there is, the better.
Monopoly bad, competition good.
Yeah, and monopolies only happen, if we want to get philosophical, when government enforces them. So the fiat monopoly is but it's interesting. The free market being in essence the black market, the unregulated, the non-government controlled market, is always harder for the average person, the non-activist or evangelist, to get involved in. So the more that these kind of other systems are built up and become more mainstream, the better. So Alabama, very positive. SB 156. A number of states have passed similar laws. We talked about Texas, Utah. There's also Arizona, not Idaho yet, but hopefully sometime soon. So undermine the Fed, use currency competition. Moving over to Illinois, they just sent to the governor SB 2298 does this fully legalize industrial hemp?
Well, so it's one of those kind of sort of bills. it really looks like from reading the legislation that they're going to try to create a federally compliant.
Can we make that an official category?
A kind of sort of bill.
I mean,
think we should.
technically they all are. Now, okay, this kind of sets off a kind of a light bulb for me. Technically, they all are. For those
Yeah.
people who follow us, I think follow us closely, you recognize that we aren't of the mindset that all you need is a bunch of state governments to do the right thing and then everyone's going to be free. No, we recognize that there are more politicians on a state level that are just what we want them to be, and that is absolutely spineless without principles. And that means as the wind blows, they will do whatever the wind says. And when the wind blows in a positive direction, they'll do that.
Yep.
And so the more that they do that, that's a positive thing. But without the general public actually taking action, not necessarily just to get a bill passed, but to actually implement what the bill passage is all about, nothing happens. So we've made videos on it. We've talked about it. Real ID. There were a number of states over the years that rejected the Real ID Act. But if people decide to get Real ID cards, then it doesn't matter what the state governments do. It really gets down to it's all about human action. So those Mises Institute supporters, Austrian economics, it's about human action. So whether Illinois passes a kinda or a sorta hemp legalization, in the end, it matters less what Illinois passes and more what residents of Illinois do with it. Is that a good setup? Does that? Okay.
Absolutely. And people want to grow hemp. And the fact of the matter is, with the way the federal law is written, you really can't have a federally compliant hemp program and have any kind of hemp program, not even a research program, because the law is so convoluted. It's been interpreted in such a crazy way. If your hemp program that you think is federally compliant is producing CBD oil, it's not federally compliant. And
wait, let's back up and explain what that means first. So in 2014, Barack Obama signed the Farm Bill. It's this yearly piece of garbage that gets passed every year. And he signed this, and a lot of people think that it legalizes or allows hemp programs to be started in the states. But there's a caveat. It's only authorized under the auspices of a university-sponsored research program, not to be used or sold in commercial activity.
Right.
So people are allowed to grow it. They're allowed to study it, as long as they're participating in some kind of a licensed research program of a university. But once they grow it and study it, they're not supposed to sell it. But everywhere this is happening, even in the federally compliant ones like Kentucky, people are still selling this stuff. So it's the end result, what people do, is much more important.
I was in my local grocery store just the other day, and they have a whole section of Kentucky hemp products. And I just chuckled at myself because I thought, you guys are breaking the law.
You should get a nice picture of that next time and do a little blog about it. No, it would be a great blog because it shows an example. Here's a state. Kentucky is one of those states where they're supposedly federally compliant. They're only doing research. They're growing a ton, like thousands of acres of hemp. But according to the feds, once it's grown and studied how to grow it or market it, whatever, then they got to destroy it. That's what they required in the Wickard versus Filburn case.
Yeah.
They in the 1930s, they were supposed to destroy any excess wheat, and the federal government wanted them to burn wheat to keep prices up. So they would be very happy with hemp being destroyed. So in Illinois, SB 2298, how is this like a kind of more detail on how it's kind of sorta?
So like I said, it is intended to be a federally compliant program. When you read the language of the bill, it talks about the pilot program. It talks about following the federal research guidelines. But the verbiage also leaves the door open for commercial sales. There's nothing prohibiting commercial sales. So I anticipate that you're going to see a system develop, much like we have in Kentucky or what we've seen in other states that have these federally compliant. You're still going to have commercial hemp. You're still going to have CBD oil research and sales. And again, this is something that the FDA has emphatically said is illegal. The CBD oil is the medicinal compound that's made out of hemp that's often used to treat seizures in children. And so not supposed to be selling that. All of these states are selling it. So they can say that it's going to be federally compliant. It's not. And then probably or hopefully what we'll see is exactly what happened in West Virginia, where they flat out just finally said, you know what, this whole federally compliant thing doesn't work. We're going to let anybody grow hemp for whatever reason, and the federal government can do what it wants to. But here in the state of West Virginia, we're going to issue licenses to everybody, even for commercial. So this is an example of a state that started trying to be federally compliant, actually acknowledged that it was hindering the development of a hemp industry in the state, and has now broadened its law to basically say, screw you feds, we're going to do it our way here, and we're going to develop a viable hemp industry.
That's SB 475 is the third iteration of that. We're going to have to cover that more in our next episode. I also want to mention one more bill, and we're going to have to run. In New York, there's a new bill that was just filed to end Common Core in the state of New York, A10890. But we're going to be following that, the new law in West Virginia to expand the hemp program, plus another one in Colorado that was just sent to the governor, HB 1020, for a signature to expand asset forfeiture restrictions. But we'll cover that in the next episode. And for those of you who support our work, make sure to follow us over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. And we will see you next time here at 10th or Tuesday.